Hey guys. Tonight, we're slipping past the lotus-draped columns of ancient Egypt to settle into the jeweled, suffocating world of royal queenswear. The walls may shimmer with gold, but they're closing in. You step barefoot onto polished limestone, cooled by the night air. Incense curls from copper braziers, painting the ceiling with smoke that smells like myrrh and jasmine. Somewhere behind a curtain, someone giggles too loudly. Somewhere else, someone cries into a linen pillow. You've entered the Hermnot, the fantasy version with harp music and grapes. But the real thing, a gilded labyrinth of silence, tension, and veiled ambition. You're not here as a servant or an official. You're invisible tonight, which is lucky, because frankly, you probably wouldn't survive 10 minutes as one of these royal women, especially not the queens. Most outsiders think of crowns and eyeliner and little else. But in here, power is both a gift and a trap. And no one knows that better than the women born or forced into Egypt's most exclusive club. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all listen from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in Thebes, around 1300 BCE. The sun has long set, but the palace breathes in its own rhythm. The queens live in the inner quarters, a separate wing behind the public halls. It's not a prison technically, but make no mistake, you don't leave unless summoned. Most of the women you see are draped in translucent linen, hair blackened with henna, arms stacked with gold. Their rooms smell like almond oil and heated stone. It's all very glamorous until you realize most of them are teenagers. Or younger. The harem, or perkeneret, is a state institution. A bureaucrat keeps track of everything, from food rations to perfume inventory to the lineage of each concubine's children. Yes, there's a spreadsheet of wombs. In papyrus form. You'd think being married to a living god would come with some perks. But in truth, the role of a queen, especially a great royal wife, is complicated. You're expected to be beautiful, fertile, politically savvy, devout, and 100% loyal to a man who probably has 17 other favorites. One minute you're sipping pomegranate wine from a carved alabaster goblet. The next you're dodging rumors of poisonings over breakfast. The walls are painted with serene images, lotus blossoms, graceful dancers, divine rebirth. But behind the walls, things get far less graceful. Rivalry simmers like lentil stew on an open flame. Whispers coil through the halls. Who has the pharaoh's ear? Who might be pregnant? Who had a bad dream that somehow coincides with a new chief scribe being dismissed? Historians still argue whether the harem functioned primarily as a pleasure palace or a political quarantine zone. Some believe it was a space of female empowerment, where queens could wield soft power behind the scenes. Others point to the records of harem conspiracies, like the infamous one involving Queen Tia's descendants, as evidence that isolation bred resentment, and resentment bred plots. But what's undeniable is this: the harem was a crucible. Queens either learned to manipulate its silent rules or got smothered by them. You peek inside one chamber, A woman is painting her lips with crushed carmine beetles, not because she wants to look nice, but because today might be the day the pharaoh notices her again. Or doesn't. And either outcome has consequences. Another queen traces a spell onto the floor in old glyphs, just to ensure her son survives the month. One quirky but real tidbit: ancient Egyptian queens often wore perfume cones, literal cones of scented wax in their wigs. As the night warmed, the cone would melt slowly, releasing fragrance. Practical? Not really, but very on-brand for a society that turned everything, even hygiene, into divine theater. You slip past a storage room full of sandals, bolts of dyed linen, sealed jars, labeled with symbols for fig paste and honey cakes. The logistics of keeping this many women clothed, fed, entertained, and politically contained are staggering. Somewhere, a stressed-out steward is absolutely losing his mind over missing coal pots. And then there's the quiet danger. No one speaks of the sudden disappearance. One day a queen is playing Senate on the balcony. The next, her name is scraped from the wall, and her maids reassigned. No one asks. No one answers. You take one last look at the murals. They lie. They show queens with perfect symmetry and cat-like poise, heads tilted at the same angle as the gods. But here, on the ground, queens age. They bleed. They get jealous. They sometimes disappear without a trace. And you start to wonder how many of them wanted this life, and how many simply had no choice. You're woken not by sunlight, but by the scrape of reed sandals across polished floors. The queens are already up, already dressed, already maneuvering. You expected royal mornings to be relaxed, maybe luxurious. But in this world, girlhood ends before it really starts. You're barely tall enough to peek over a lotus basin when you're handed a wig and told to smile like the goddess Hathor. One of the younger girls, maybe alone at most, is being coached by a scribe on how to address the pharaoh not too meek, not too bold, and definitely no mention of feeling homesick for her mother's garden. Child queens. It sounds like a nightmare wrapped in gold leaf. But in ancient Egypt, this wasn't strange. If anything, it was the default. Royal daughters were married off almost as soon as they could be considered of age, which could mean as early as 10. Some were wed to their own fathers or half-brothers to preserve divine bloodlines, a concept that would probably make modern geneticists cry into their microscopes. You pass by one such newlywed princess now. She's dressed in pleated linen, so crisp it looks carved. She adjusts her headdress with shaking hands and smiles at the wall, instead of anyone else in the room. Historians still argue whether these marriages were purely symbolic or consummated in full. The uncomfortable truth is that the answer may differ queen to queen, dynasty to dynasty, depending on whether the pharaoh needed an heir or just the appearance of religious legitimacy. Whatever the case, the result is the same. A young girl, far from anything that resembles a childhood, thrust into a world of adult expectations and deadly missteps. You follow a group of palace attendants into a side room filled with makeup palettes, lapis eye paint, and tiny silver razors. The queens sit for their daily beautification, though beautification feels like the wrong word. This is more like armor being applied. Their faces are blank as servants brush crushed malachite across their eyelids and dab perfumed oils onto their wrists. There's no conversation, just the scrape of stone tools and the occasional cough when someone inhales too much incense. It might be the most glamorous kindergarten in history. One girl hums under her breath as her wig is adjusted. Another grips a small amulet so hard her knuckles turn white. They aren't nervous because they're meeting their husband. Today, they're nervous because they might not. In a palace where being forgotten can be fatal. Obscurity is its own kind of death sentence. You pause beside a tall papyrus scroll pinned to the wall, showing a queen being led by Anubis toward judgment. It's the classic scene scales. Feathers. Hearts, but someone's added a faint charcoal scribble in the corner. A doodle of a girl with crooked pigtails and wide eyes. No name. Just the outline. It's a tiny rebellion. A flash of personality in a world that smooths everything into polished calm. And yet, there were moments of real agency. Occasionally, child queens became power players in their own right. Consider Ankhesenamun, the young wife of Tutankhamun, who may have once written a desperate letter to a foreign king begging for a husband after her boy Pharaoh died. Or Princess Neferur, daughter of Hatshepsut, who was given priestly titles and appeared in inscriptions alongside adult male officials. These girls weren't just decoration, they were part of the machine, sometimes the oil, sometimes the gear itself. But that doesn't make it less disturbing. You think about your own awkward middle school years, and then try to imagine going through puberty while simultaneously being worshipped as a living goddess and manipulated like a pawn in an eternal chess match. You wouldn't last 5 minutes. One fringe practice you overhear discussed quietly among older queens is the use of birth amulets made of carnelian or ivoritiny charms tucked into waistbands to promote fertility and ward off misfortune. A girl might receive one before her first moon cycle, not as a keepsake, but as a warning. Welcome to womanhood. Try not to die in childbirth. You walk past a row of scrolls listing temple offerings, noting how many were donated by royal daughters. Gold, lapis, grain. Geesites unclear whether these were gifts or taxes. The line between generosity and obligation gets blurry when your family runs a theocracy. One servant whispers to another that a young queen tried to refuse the offering ritual last week. She hasn't been seen since. The second servant shrugs. Maybe she's just resting. You both know she isn't. By the time evening comes, the younger queens are led back to their quarters. Heads bowed, ankles aching from hours of standing in ceremonial sandals. They look like they're sleepwalking. A few laugh. A few stare into space. One sings a lullaby in a forgotten dialect, probably something her wet nurse taught her before she was shipped upriver to marry a stranger. You lie back on a carved bench, watching the stars appear through the open roof. You can still smell the resin on their hair, the bitterness of crushed beetles on their lips, the faint, sour tinge of fear that never really leaves the air in these walls. And you wonder, when exactly does a girl become a queen? Is it the wedding, the makeup, the first offering? Or is it just the moment she learns to hide her real name behind one that fits the story? You wake to the sound of drums, but not the celebratory kind. These are slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat muffled behind heavy stone. Someone's getting married, or maybe being promoted, or maybe both. It's hard to tell in this place where roles blur and rituals pile on top of one another like sand in the wind. You step back into the inner courtyard, drawn toward a gathering near the sacred pool. Palm trees sway slightly. The only thing here allowed to move without consequence. Today's ceremony is intimate, symbolic, and deeply awkward. A sister marrying her brother. Or, rather, a princess marrying her half-brother, who also happens to be the pharaoh. You can almost hear modern viewers pausing the video, blinking hard. But in ancient Egypt, this was strategy, not scandal. The royal bloodline wasn't just a metaphor, it was a divine conveyor belt. Keeping it pure meant marrying your sibling wasn't taboo, it was a political duty. Historians still argue whether these sibling marriages were emotionally real or strictly ceremonial. Some scholars believe the relationships were more spiritual than romantic, with separate sleeping quarters and separate lives. Others point to fertility symbols and joint tombs to argue that the unions were fully marital in every sense. Honestly, if the gods themselves modeled this behavior, Isis and Osiris, it's no surprise the humans followed suit. You edge closer as the bride is led forward. She's draped in white, eyes darkened with kohl, a delicate uraeus cobra tucked into her wig. Her brother stands still, a figure carved from prophecy and protocol, barely old enough to shave. They exchange ceremonial oils and lotus garlands, and everyone claps politely as if this isn't deeply weird. But you get it. You really do. Because, in this world, where every grain of sand is stamped with divine will, the lines between family, politics, and ritual blur fast. If your power is inherited through your blood, then preserving that blood becomes more important than comfort, or common sense, or biology textbooks. It's like ancient Egypt decided to skip the family therapist and go straight for the throne room. You follow the couple as they're led into the banquet hall, another strange mix of public spectacle and private discomfort. Harpists pluck melodies too gentle for the tension in the air. Priests murmur blessings about fruitfulness and harmony. And somewhere behind a curtain, you swear you hear someone snort in disbelief. The older queens watch with painted smiles. One of them, perhaps the groom's mother, offers the bride a bracelet made from lapis and electrum. Another places a small votive statue into her Hansa fertility figure, with wide hips and a mysterious smirk. It's unclear if the gesture is welcoming, warning, or both. You slip away for a moment, weaving through a hallway filled with painted scenes of royal couples embracing before the gods. In almost every image, the queen looks composed, serene, utterly untouchable. But you can't help noticing the stiffness in their poses. They don't look like lovers. They look like sculptures, posed for eternity under the weight of expectation. Back in the main chamber, the newly married pair offers incense to the gods. A thin curl of smoke winds upward, delicate as a secret. The priests chant, invoking Hathor for joy, Isis for loyalty, and sometimes Bastet because in Egypt, even cats have opinions on marriage. One odd tidbit you overhear from a kitchen servant: there's a long-standing superstition that if the wedding honey cakes crack during baking, the marriage will be cursed. So naturally, there's a backup batch, and a backup, because in a kingdom where fate is everything, even dessert is strategic. Later that night, you pass by their shared quarter-slavish. Yes, but silent, the kind of quiet that makes your skin itch. Are they speaking, Are they awkwardly pretending to sleep? Is the whole thing being documented by a scribe behind a screen? You can't know, but you suspect both of them would rather be anywhere else. And yet, here's the thing. These sibling marriages sometimes produced powerful queens. Women who knew how to rule because they'd grown up inside the ritual machinery. Women who learned early that affection was optional. But power had to be studied, practiced, and defended like a fortress. You think of Queen Ahmose Nefertari, wife and sister to Pharaoh Ahmose I. She became one of the most revered royal women in Egyptian history, worshipped for centuries after her death. Was she happy? Did she love her husband-brother? Did she care? Or did she just focus on ruling well enough to matter? You pause beside a relief showing two royal siblings seated together, hands barely touching. A servant fans them. A cat dozes nearby. Their expressions are identical calm, unreadable, eternal. And as you slip back into the corridor, you wonder how many queens traded comfort for control. How many learned to swallow their feelings whole, chew them down with lotus wine, and smile anyway. Because in ancient Egypt, duty wasn't just to crown it, was a leash disguised in gold. You're trailing behind a procession now. One that smells like jasmine, sweat, and something vaguely metallic frankincense. Maybe, or just tension masked in perfume. The queen at the front is smiling, the kind of smile that stretches just far enough to convince a god, but not quite far enough to comfort a servant. Her eyes, on the other hand, are pure calculation. You don't know her name. Maybe no one really does anymore. But right now, she's stepping into the temple courtyard as if she owns it because, in some ways, she does. Queens in Egypt weren't just decoration. They were symbols, figureheads, and sometimes stand-ins for goddesses, and not the soft, motherly kind. No. The real prototype for queenship was a cocktail of Hathor's seductive smile and Sekhmet's blood-soaked claws. You're expected to embody both. You are the living essence of divine femininity kind. Nurturing, desirable, but cross the line, offend the gods, threaten the throne, then suddenly you're Sekhmet, a lioness with a taste for vengeance. That duality wasn't a flaw. It was the job description. Acolytes throw flower petals at the queen's feet as she ascends the temple stairs. Behind her, musicians play a rhythmic beat on bronze sistrums. The beat isn't fast. It's methodical. The kind of rhythm you can march to or go to war with. The high priest murmurs praise to Hathor, calling her Mistress of Turquoise and Lady of Drunkenness. You wonder if anyone here remembers that in one myth, Hathor was sent by Ra to destroy humanity. Got a little too into the assignment, and had to be tricked into stopping by being fed beer, dyed red to look like blood. You glance at the queen again. Yep, she's definitely the type who knows that story. Probably quotes it at parties. Historians still argue whether Egyptian queens had actual military authority or simply ceremonial roles in state functions. Some point to reliefs showing queens leading troops or standing over subdued enemies. Others argue these are symbolic gestures, reinforcing divine power rather than literal leadership. Either way, you'd be wise not to underestimate a woman trained from birth to represent both beauty and annihilation in equal parts. You step into the temple proper, where incense clings to your skin and the air feels thick enough to drink. Here, the queen becomes something else. Not a sister. Not a wife. Not a mortal. She's channeling Hathor, now goddess of music, motherhood, sensuality, and, yes, destruction. The priest hands her a bouquet of blue lotus blossoms, and she raises them slowly, ceremonially, like someone lifting a blade. This isn't just pageantry. It's performance laced with consequence. Every gesture is part of a language spoken between gods and mortals, and the queen is expected to be fluent. You glance at the audience court officials, temple servants, rival wives lurking at the edges. No one blinks. No one breathes. This is not a moment for improvisation. A quirky but real detail. During some of these temple rituals, queens would wear specially consecrated wigs, woven with beads of lapis lazuli and tiny gold charms, shaped like divine symbols. Imagine trying to hold a straight face with 25 sacred trinkets clinking near your ear. Yet somehow, she pulls it off. The ritual ends not with applause, but with silence. The queen bows to the altar, and for a moment, you see the weight of it hit her. Not just the crown, but the pressure of being more than mortal, expected to navigate a world where love is calculated, children are political assets, and beauty must always be effortless, even on days when you want to throw your makeup palette into the Nile. As she exits, a slave girl rushes forward to reapply a dab of frankincense oil behind her ears. The queen doesn't acknowledge her, not out of cruelty, but because acknowledgement might humanize Herond in this role. Humanity is a liability. Back in her private chamber, you notice the walls. Not grand murals, but small, painted senescos grazing under stars. A boat floating downriver. A pair of sandals resting beside a threshold. Tiny pieces of serenity. As if the queen needs these reminders of normalcy to stay sane, or at least to pretend. She removes her headdress carefully, and for a fleeting second, her expression softens. No guards. No priests. No gods watching. Just a woman with tired shoulders and 1,000 things she cannot say. She pours a cup of sweet wine and sips slowly. The first unscripted act you've seen her make all day, and you realize, being a queen in Egypt isn't about power or luxury. It's about performance. You must seduce, soothe, command, avenge, and do it all without letting the mask slip. You are Hathor in the sunlight. You are Sekhmet in the shadows. And if you do it well enough, history might remember your name. But probably not. You're not sure what you expect when you follow the queen down the quieter hallways of the palace. Maybe the sound of trickling water, or a cat purring in some sun-warmed corner. But instead, you catch the softest of whispers, low, deliberate, and just urgent enough to make you pause. That's when it hits you. This place is as much a theater of secrets as it is of ceremony. And just like any good palace, it's got a backstage. Welcome to the politics and poison bowls portion of the royal experience. The queen glides past a courtyard filled with birds' abysses, mostly pausing briefly to accept a scroll from a scribe with an expression too neutral to be real. She doesn't break stride. You wouldn't either. Because in this palace, you never let anyone know what you're really thinking. Ever. You duck into a corner chamber lit by narrow slits in the wall and the faint glow of polished copper mirrors. A few royal wives are gathered here, not lounging, but conferring. You hear names spoken in coded tones. Phrases like unexpected illness and revised inheritance. One woman stirs a cup of lotus tea with a silver spoon. Very slowly, another adjusts a bracelet. Her eyes locked on the hallway. They're not gossiping. They're planning. Historians still argue whether the infamous harem conspiracy against Ramses III was an isolated plot or just the only one we found records of. A group of secondary wives and their allisunics. Scribes. Servants allegedly schemed to kill the pharaoh and elevate their son to the throne. The trial records are fascinatingly messy, with accusations, denials, and a parade of names we otherwise wouldn't know. One even reads like a palace HR report gone wildly off the rails. Spoiler, the plot failed. But it showed everyone exactly how deep the ambition could run. You walk past a storeroom that smells off-spiced wine. Sure, but also something mustier. More medicinal. The jars are unlabeled, which is never a good sign. One shelf holds a stack of folded linen sachets. Inside, herbs known for both calming nerves and allegedly inducing miscarriages. It's hard to say which outcome is intended here. It all depends on who's holding the cup. You keep moving, trying not to breathe too deeply. A scribe passes you in a hurry, holding a stylus and a wax tablet covered in neat glyphs. You catch a glimpse, calculations, numbers, grain storage, or perhaps dowries. Hard to tell. Everything here doubles as something else, a slightly fringe but documented tidbit. Certain queens were known to keep personal herbariums, small gardens of medicinal plants, including blue lotus, mandrake, and something called dream herb, believed to induce prophetic visions or soothe insomnia. Picture it, a royal woman kneeling in the moonlight beside her private patch of psychotropic flora, whispering to Thoth about her enemies. You exit into the garden courtyard, a rare open space where queens are permitted to walk without an entourage. The air smells of date palms and crushed mint. A few older women sit beneath a trellis, pretending to weave. They talk softly, hands moving automatically. One mentions the high priest of Amun in a tone too casual to be casual. Another mutters about the boy's tutor, which could mean anything from a political ally to a knife in the dark. Everyone here is playing some version of a long game. Some queens have their eyes on the throne, others on their children's futures. Some just want to survive long enough to be buried properly, with their name intact on the tomb wall. Because in ancient Egypt, erasure wasn't just death, it was annihilation. The worst fate was to become no one. You pass through a passageway filled with inscriptions of royal achievements. They're meant to inspire awe. But now you see them differently. Each monument is also a message. I was here. I mattered. Don't scrape my name off. You wonder how many of these queens commissioned their own propaganda while simultaneously plotting their rival's downfall. The queen you're following enters a small, windowless room. It's filled with scrolls and polished stones, each one etched with prayers and spells. She runs her fingers over a charm shaped like a scarab, whispering something in a dialect you don't recognize. Not all warfare here is done with blades. Some of it is ink, incense, and intention. One of the most fiercely debated topics among Egyptologists is how much actual influence queens wielded behind the scenes. Some say they were merely ceremonial, paraded around for ritual value. Others argue they had immense soft power through their children, their relationships with priests, even their private scribes. There's increasing evidence that certain queens acted almost like co-regents, especially when the pharaoh was young, ill, or distracted by wars. Back in her private chamber, the queen takes off her jewelry one piece at a time, each motion careful, not weary measured. A golden cuff, a pearl-inlaid ring, a pectoral depicting the Eye of Horus. Each item goes into a locked chest shaped like a jackal. You get the sense she's shedding a costume, not relaxing, a warrior removing armor. You spot a mirror carved from polished obsidian. She glances into it briefly, just long enough to check what the world sees. Then she walks away, and, just like that, the whispers stop. The poison is back in its vial. The game board is cleared for the next day. Because that's the cycle here: conceal, calculate, survive. The palace may shimmer on the outside, but within these polished halls, danger clinks more softly than gold. You're beginning to notice a pattern. Every room, every corridor, every gaze from one queen to another carries a kind of tension, like the silk curtains themselves are holding their breath. This isn't a palace. It's a chessboard carved from alabaster and fear. And the queens are pieces that refuse to stay in place. Today, you're ushered into the Hall of Ancestors. Akul. Shadowed space lined with statues. Not of kings, not even of gods, but of royal women. Some sit, some stand. All stare down at you with that same unreadable calm, like they know exactly how this story ends. One of the attendants tells you this is where the living queens come to meditate, or confess, or plot. It's flexible. As you move from statue to statue, you start to notice something. These women are not idealized. They're not beautiful in the same mass-produced way you've seen in other art. They're individualized. Sharp cheeks here, a hooked nose there, a furrowed brow on a stone queen who looks like she's just been told her offering quota has doubled. Real women. Real influence, carved into eternity. There's one name that keeps coming up: Ta, the great royal wife of Amenhotep III. She wasn't born royal, her parents were powerful, but commoners. Yet Ta became one of the most formidable queens in Egypt's long history. Foreign diplomats wrote to her directly. She appeared in statues equal in size to her husband, which in this society wasn't just flattering, it was radical. Historians still argue whether she held power behind the scenes or outright ruled during her son Akhenaten's reign. Either way, Ta is proof that queenship wasn't always about marriage. Sometimes, it was about mastery. You pause at a small altar, tucked behind one of the columns. It's surrounded by fresh offerings dates, lotus petals, a clay pot of honey, and a carved plaque bearing the name of Queen Ahotep. According to legend, she rallied troops during the war against the Hyksos and was buried with ceremonial weapons. Whether she fought herself or merely organized the defense remains a scholarly debate, but either way, she's remembered as a protector of Egypt. Her tomb inscription literally praises her for pacifying Egypt and expelling the rebels. Basically, she's the ancient version of someone who'd stare down a tank in a house, robe and win. You glance upward. The ceiling is painted like the night sky deep blue with gold stars. Each one carefully placed to represent the constellations seen from Thebes at midsummer. This was more than decoration. It was a reminder. Above every queen, no matter how powerful, loom at eternity. Their legacy would be written not just in ink, but in the stars themselves. You wonder how many of them lay awake at night, wondering which version of their story would survive. And speaking of surviving stories, you find yourself staring at a statue that's been altered. The face has been chiseled off, the name erased. No offerings. No incense. Just a broken shell of someone who once mattered. Probably. You ask an attendant about her. He shrugs. She displeased someone. He says, almost kindly, that's all it takes. In this world, memory is a privilege, not a right. A fringe belief held by some priests in later dynasties suggested that a queen's spiritual power could persist even after death, especially if her statue remained intact and received offerings. That's why the erasure of name and image was such a harsh punishment. It wasn't just symbolic. It was spiritual execution. A second death. The kind you don't come back from. You sit beside one of the statues and close your eyes. It's cool here. Quiet. And you realize this is as close as these women ever got to peace. In life, they performed, calculated, survived. In death, they were either immortalized or deleted. No in between. Then, just as you're about to leave, a temple scribe hurries in with a scroll. He's young, nervous, and clearly not meant to be here during the Queen's hour. He mutters something about a forgotten decree. Something about taxes owed by the temples. You catch a few words. Grain. Tribute. Hathor's festival. A few of the elder queens share a look. A festival means optics. It means offerings. It means making sure the public still believes the gods smile on the palace even when things behind the scenes are crumbling. You follow them as they sweep from the hall into action, draped in fresh linen. All traces of reflection gone. The statues remain behind, watching silently, as if to say, yes, yes, this is how it's done. And you can't help but think, every queen here is two people. The one she is now, walking and breathing and strategizing, and the one she's building, stroke by stroke. In stone, it's not about surviving the day. It's about surviving history. You're led through an arched gateway just off the central courtyard, where a low breeze drifts across papyrus-lined pools. A servant opens a carved cedar door, and you step into what can only be described as a royal storage closet for status symbols, jeweled sandals, ceremonial fans, perfumears, shaped like cats, and most notably a shelf stacked with ivory tablets listing royal consorts. So many names. So many titles. And all under one pharaoh. Welcome to the complicated mess that is the pharaoh's romantic portfolio. You thought your dating history was a nightmare. Try being the 18th beloved of the king in a court where your ranking depends on how closely you're related, how politically useful you are, and whether your eyeliner smudged during yesterday's offering to Horus. The first great royal wife gets the glory. Sure, The titles, the statues, the grand tomb. But she's not alone. Oh no. There are dozens of other women circling the throne, like satellites some foreign princesses sent to seal alliances, others high-born locals trying to elevate their house, and a few who caught the pharaoh's eye during a particularly tipsy lotus wine banquet. And that's not even counting the royal concubines. Yes. Plural. Yes. Always. One scroll tucked in the corner of the chamber, probably not meant to be seen, includes an annotated list of queens with little footnotes. Daughter of the vassal from Kadesh. Brought dowry of cedarwood and lapis. Danced beautifully at spring equinox. You're half expecting to see ghosted the king after feast, scribbled in faded ink. A mainstream historical fact. Pharaoh Ramses II reportedly had over 100 children and multiple wives. But Queen Nefertari remained his most publicly beloved. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is among the most lavish in existence, covered in vivid imagery and prayers that suggest deep affection or, at the very least, impeccable père. Historians still argue whether Nefertari held significant political power or simply benefited from being the favored consort in a very crowded field. You're invited sort of into the Queen's Garden. A lush walled enclosure where royal women gather away from the clamor of court. It looks peaceful at first. Bougainvillea climbing the walls. Low cushions set in the shade. A harpist playing something mournful by the fountain. But don't be fooled. This is less a garden and more a diplomatic arena with eyeliner. A young queen, possibly foreign. Judging by her dressets alone beneath a fig tree, her attendants whisper nearby. You catch fragments of their conversation. Something about feeling invisible. About being watched too closely. Another queen saunters by and pointedly compliments her sandals. It's the ancient Egyptian version of "nice top, where's it from?" with a serrated undertone. What's fascinating is how rigid and yet unstable the hierarchy is. Even if you're the first wife, a political misstepper, heaven forbid, a fertility issue could knock you down the ladder. And if you're a lesser wife with a son who suddenly becomes heir, well, congratulations. You're now surrounded by 10 other women who are definitely pretending to be happy for you. You hear a servant recount a fringe tidbit that in one dynasty, a concubine rose so far in power she was given a throne name and depicted smiting Egypt's enemies in temple carvings. No one remembers her original name, just that she started as a singer and ended as a storm. True or not, the story circulates like incense sweet. Smoky. Maybe a little poisonous. The Queen Mother occasionally visits this garden too. When she does, everyone rises. She's the only woman here whose power doesn't depend on whether she's still producing heirs. She already did that. Now she commands respect simply by breathing. She offers advice that sounds friendly, but lands like prophecy. Be careful of silence. She tells one young wife, "It's the most expensive sound in this court." One queen sits carving tiny scarabs from lapis lazuli. She gives you one as you pass. "For luck," she says, but doesn't smile. You tuck it away, unsure whether it's a charm or a warning. Probably both. And then there's the matter of jealousy. Of course there is. How could there not be? When affection is currency, every compliment from the king is a minor shift in the power balance. One kiss too long. One gold bangle gifted without explanation. and suddenly alliances form. Whispers stir, and breakfast feels like a battlefield. You notice subtle tactics. One wife insists on being seen offering wine to the king during public ceremony as an act of devotion, not coincidentally a statement of access. Another begins taking lessons in temple music, aligning herself with Hathor's priesthood. Strategic. All of it, as the sun dips behind the wall, casting long shadows across the garden. The queens retreat to their chambers. You linger a moment longer. A small carved cat statue watches from a ledge, eyes narrowed. Maybe it's just a decoration. Or maybe, like everything else here, it's watching, measuring, judging. You realize that in this palace, love isn't about emotion. It's about rank, visibility, leverage. The pharaoh's heart is a political asset, and every queen is just trying to lease a sliver of it long enough to matter. You wake up figuratively speaking in the back of a linen-draped palanquin, bumping gently as servants carry you across the palace grounds. The air smells of myrrh, old stone, and something faintly metallic. You're being taken to the royal birthing chamber. Not for a birth today, at least. Not yet, but to observe, quietly, how the queens prepare for their most high-stakes role of all, producing the next divine heir. Childbirth for a queen isn't just biological, it's national security. The stakes are astronomical. You produce a healthy boy, and you're the exalted mother of a potential pharaoh. Produce no children or worse. Daughters only. You may find yourself increasingly excluded from court processions. Your name slipping lower on the guest lists. Your chamber's incense supply mysteriously downgraded. You're led into a domed room, painted with images of Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, lumbering across the walls like a divine doula. Clay charms dangle from the ceiling. One nurse gently rattles a sistrum to keep spirits away, while another adjusts an amulet hanging around the belly of a very pregnant queen, who sits cross-legged on a cushion, her face serene, but clearly over it. A midwife stirs something thick and herbal in a copper pot. You're not sure if it's for pain relief or warding off curses. Honestly, it could be both. A well-known historical fact. Ancient Egyptians had surprisingly detailed medical knowledge about childbirth. They used tools like birthing stools, which allowed gravity to assist during labor, and papyri survive that describe ways to predict the baby's sex, including the somewhat bizarre method of watering barley and wheat with the mother's urine. If the barley sprouts first, it's a boy. If wheat sprouts, it's a girl. If neither sprouts, well, awkward. The queen you're observing is on her third pregnancy. She's had one surviving daughter, one stillbirth. You can feel the pressure in the room, not from her necessarily, but from everyone around her. The palace physicians hover just out of reach. The attendants whisper predictions based on moon phases. The senior wife hasn't visited. That silence is loud. In another corner of the palace, a scribe is updating the line of succession scroll. You're told he edits it in pencil-thin ink strokes, so it's easier to revise. Some names have been scraped off so often. The papyrus is beginning to thin. You wonder how many ghost princes and lost daughters are layered into that parchment, like phantoms no one speaks of. One quirky tidbit from the private physician's chamber. A birthing spell requires the mother to chew dates soaked in beer, while reciting the names of 5 protective deities. Then spit into the north corner of the room. No one is sure why the north. Tradition. The priest mutters, which, to be fair, explains about half of everything in this place. As the queen breathes deeply, a servant fans her with a feathered palm. She wears an amulet of BEs, a dwarf god known for guarding against evil spirits and making babies laugh. The combination of protection and mischief feels fitting. You like Bess. He's chaotic, good energy in a court that's mostly polite menace. Historians still argue whether royal sons were always the preferred heirs, or if daughters could, under the right conditions, to be elevated as co-rulers, or even pharaohs. Cases like Hatshepsut show it was possible, though usually framed in masculine symbolism, and sometimes literally depicted with a false beard to placate tradition. Even so, the royal uterus was political territory, and a queen's fertility could either secure her legacy or doom it. Later, you're taken into the shrine room where newborns are blessed. A priest recites prayers while waving incense over a cradle carved from sycamore wood. Nearby, a painted scene shows Isis suckling Horus, a divine reminder that good mothers raise gods. The implication is clear. No pressure or anything. You sit beside a different queen now, one who's recently miscarried. No one speaks of it openly, but you can read it in the lines under her eyes. She fingers a broken amulet, says nothing, and stares out at the courtyard. A cat slinks by. She doesn't move. There's no comfort here. Only ritual. Grief is tucked away beneath official duties and honeyed offerings. You're expected to resume smiling, wearing the right linen, to attending temple festivals, as if your body isn't still recovering from loss. In the women's quarters, you overhear midwives murmuring about which queens are lucky. You hear terms like fruitful, blessed, protected. You also hear cursed, dry, troublesome. They pretend it's all the will of the gods. But everyone knows that outcomes are interpreted through the lens of power. The gods don't punish people. The court does. One servant mentions a rumor that a rival queen once slipped, crushed mandrake root into another's wine, intending to induce fertility, but possibly overdosing. The records say she fell ill from joy. Translation: someone rewrote the story to make it less awkward. As night falls, the birthing chamber empties. The pregnant queen is helped back to her chamber, wrapped in fresh linens, her brow dotted with myrrh. She's smiling faintly, but you can see the calculation behind it. She knows what's expected, knows that every kick from within could be the next error, a complication waiting to be spun into court gossip. You're left standing in the hallway, the scent of saffron and soot clinging to your sleeves. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries. Somewhere else, a name is quietly erased from a scroll. And you realize, in ancient Egypt, a queen's most sacred duty wasn't just bearing children, it was surviving the act of doing so. Again and again, with grace, silence, and a dangerously convincing smile. You wake to the sharp clack of wooden sandals on polished stone, echoing down the corridor like a warning bell with rhythm. The queen is moving. Fast. Her linen sleeves rustle like wings. Her gold earrings swing in protest. And she doesn't even glance back as her attendants scramble to keep up. Something's happened. Not the crying kind of dramatic more, the quiet kind that makes palace walls feel like they're listening. You follow. Breath held. As she turns toward the temple precinct, the temple of Amun rises in the distance like a stone mirage. Its columns etched with stories, so old, even the priests squint sometimes to remember what they mean. But it's not the grandeur that matters today. It's the power. In this kingdom, temples aren't just for worship. They're banks, schools, tax offices, and the occasional political chessboard. And queens know how to play on all of them. The queen's procession halts in a side chapel, shaded by a sycamore tree, the tree of life and death. Of course, she lights incense with a snap of flint and kneels before a statue of Mut, the lion-headed goddess, mother of pharaohs and occasional destroyer of cities. Standard multitasking. The priestess beside her murmurs invocations. You try to listen, but your eyes are drawn to the offering tray. Pomegranates, obsidian beads, a roll of papyrus tied with hair, not string, hair. Someone's making a very specific request. A mainstream fact. Royal women were often high priestesses of powerful gods, especially goddesses, tied to fertility, war, or justice. Being a queen and a high priestess wasn't a conflict of interest. It was the resume. The line between divine and political was a smudge, and queens made sure they knew which gods controlled the budget. The river, and the grain quotas. Behind the chapel, you notice scribes at work tallying donations from nearby villages' grain, cattle, bolts of linen. It's all documented with fussy precision. Because temples pay taxes, sort of. Actually, they mostly redistribute taxes. And since queens often held temple estates in their own name, that meant wealth, influence, protection, especially if their sons were too young to rule yet. You pass a carved wall panel depicting Queen Hatshepsut in full regalia, offering to the gods, not as wife or mother, but as pharaoh, beard and all. Historians still argue whether her rise was accepted, tolerated, or just quietly resented by generations of male priests who later tried to erase her name. You can still see where they chiseled it off, and then someone else recarved it. Queens leave scars, even on stone, inside another temple wing. A more private ritual is unfolding. This one's not for the gods. It's for the people. A group of elite women most related to the royal family. Some not gather to prepare linen charms dipped in sacred oils. They'll be distributed during the festival of Hathor to women trying to conceive. The queen oversees the process, offering a nod here, a prayer there. She's visible, benevolent, untouchable, a goddess in linen, a PR move with sandal straps. One fringe detail, in certain rituals, the queen would lead a midnight procession carrying a papyrus torch soaked in palm wine, said to draw Hathor's favor and ward off bad dreams. The torch was extinguished at dawn in a pool of milk. Historians debate whether it was symbolic, functional, or just another example of Egyptian rituals being wonderfully over the top. Later, you're invited to the queen's private shrenia, small, incense-thick room tucked behind her chamber. It holds statues of Taret, Mut, Hathor, and a few others you can't quite name. Some are lovingly worn. 2. faces smooth from years of handling. Others are chipped. There's a bowl of milk, 3 acacia pods, and a folded cloth embroidered with protective spells. She kneels briefly, says nothing, then leaves. The silence that follows feels deliberate. You notice something else subtle, but telling. A scribe leaves a note at the base of the shrine, tied with blue thread. Not red, not black. Blue means healing. Maybe someone's ill. Maybe someone's dying. Or maybe someone's just lost the palace's favor and wants divine insurance. Walking back through the palace, you catch a servant dusting a statue of the queen holding a sistrum. It's carved in gold and lapis, small enough to fit in your hand. You ask about it. She shrugs. It sings when shaken. You try it. It's light, delicate, a whisper of a rattle. But in the right hands, even a whisper can be a command. And that's the thing. The queen doesn't rule like the pharaoh grand processions. Battle scenes, giant monuments. She rules through whispers, rituals, temple alliances, through silence that implies a threat, through gods that nod when she walks by, through offerings made not out of faith, but out of necessity. As dusk falls, the queen sits on her balcony, watching the sun sink into the Nile. Below, priests chant, boats drift, and the city exhales. You stand behind her, barely breathing. She lifts a small lotus blossom to her nose, closes her eyes, and smiles not sweetly. Strategically, you remember what the high priest said earlier today? Half joking, a pharaoh controls Egypt, but a queen, she controls the pharaoh. Huh. You're beginning to believe it. You wake to the smell of hot sand and crushed frankincense, drifting through the latticework like gossip. The palace is quieter than usual, which always means something's happening that you haven't been invited to yet. But you're getting good at picking up the patterns now. The hushed voices, the sudden flurry of linen robes moving faster than decorum usually allows, the scribes pacing, the priests pretending not to glance over their shoulders. Something's shifting. You wander toward the west wing, the one that faces the necropolis. It's not a place for public processions or state banquets. It's where preparations are made. Funeral rites, succession scrolls, legacy edits. You're told the queen has ordered a private meeting there. Not unusual. Just no table, especially since the crown prince has fallen ill. No one says it out loud, but the fear is there. If he dies, the entire structure of power has to realign. Titles will reshuffle. Alliances reform. And somewhere in all that, queens either rise or vanish. You're led through a doorway painted with stars and owl symbols of night and wisdom into a chamber that smells of cedar oil and ink. The queen sits beside a low table, speaking quietly to 2 older priestesses and a nervous-looking royal advisor. A scroll lies open before them, the ink still wet in places. You catch glimpses, temple allocations, inheritance clauses, grain tax reliefs for certain estates, all adjusted in the event of a sudden vacancy. It's as euphemistic as it is unsettling. A mainstream fact. Ancient Egyptians prepared for royal deaths in exhaustive detail. Tombs were often started during a king or queen's youth, updated with every major life event. Legal adjustments were made ahead of time to ensure a smooth transition, at least in theory. In practice, smooth was rarely the word for it. You're ushered out before the conversation ends, but not before noticing something odd. The Queen's hand is stained faintly with blue. Not ink. Lapis. It clings like memory. Or protection. Hard to tell which. You pass through the outer corridors as a group of servants prepare ceremonial items: lotus garlands, alabaster urns, finely woven shrouds. Not in mourning colors yet, but close. It's all part of being ready without saying the word death, as if avoiding it will stop it from happening. The palace's chief embalmer is summoned. You overhear him listing supplies in a voice as casual as someone reading a grocery list. Natron, linen strips, resin, amulets, silver needles. When you ask if they're preparing for a burial, he smiles politely. We're always preparing, he says. You believe him. One fringe tidbit that floats into your ear via a gossipy handmaid. Some queens reportedly left secret burial instructions on official wills, scrawled on ostraca, limestone flakes, and hidden in their personal shrines, separate from the state-approved version, just in case. Apparently, even in death, royal women weren't entirely sure who'd follow the script. You find yourself wandering toward the House of Life, a temple annex where scribes copy spells, track omens, and study dream reports. The Queen's name appears often, sometimes as benefactor, sometimes as protagonist in ritual stories. One scroll shows her invoking Maat, goddess of balance, while holding a feather and a blade. Another shows her traveling through the underworld in a boat pulled by jackals. Metaphor? Maybe. Propaganda? Definitely. You wonder which version she prefers. Historians still argue whether these depictions were literal beliefs or political theater. Some insist the queens truly saw themselves as divine vessels. Others believe it was all for show-on, ancient form of PR tailored to impress the gods and intimidate rivals. Both could be true. As sunset bleeds across the palace walls, the Queen walks silently into the court's central garden. No attendants. No music. Just her and the dying light. She stands beside a date palm and places a small token at its basia ring. Perhaps. You can't be sure. Then she just waits. After a long while, a priest approaches and whispers something. She nods once. Doesn't cry. Doesn't tremble. Just nods. A name has likely vanished from the scrolls. And with it, 1,000 subtle shifts begin. Rooms will be reassigned. Guards rotated. Estates redistributed. And most crucially, the Queen's role will change. You watch her return to her chamber. No triumphant music. No spoken grief. Just soft sandals on stone. But when she reaches the threshold, she hesitates, looks over her shoulder at the courtyard, and whispers something you can't quite hear. You strain, but all that reaches you is a breeze scented with salt and fig leaves. Later that night, you sneak back into the chapel. The statue of the Queen in her ceremonial wig now has fresh flowers at its base. You notice something new. A small mark has been added to the pedestal. Subtle, faint, but real. She's not grieving. She's ascending. And tomorrow, no one will say it aloud, but everyone will know. A queen just became something more. You rise earlier, at least. Early, by palace standards. The sun's barely cleared the roof tiles, but already the corridors hum with subtle movement. A new day means a new balance of power, and you can feel it crackling beneath the stone floors like static in silk. The queen has summoned her council, and this time, she doesn't wait for the pharaoh's advisors to set the tone. You follow the scent of sandalwood through a long colonnade toward the royal council chamber. It's shaped like a rectangle, but feels like a circle. Everyone, watching everyone, with no real corner to hide in. On a raised dais at one end sits the queen, not reclined or at leisure, but upright, alert, flanked by two carved falcons and a fan-bearer who looks too nervous to blink. She doesn't speak first. She waits. Power, here, is shown by who fills the silence and who forces others to do it first. A general clears his throat, mentions the southern border. A priest brings up barley shortages near Thebes. A treasurer gently suggests a tax deferral for temple estates. The queen nods, listens, asks questions that cut deeper than they seem to. How long have the granaries reported spoilage? Has the Nile's flood been less generous? Or just mismeasured? Who signed off on this shipment of silver? Again? She's not showing off. She's showing memory. The kind of memory that keeps her name etched in records long after others are scratched out. A mainstream fact. Several Egyptian queens, especially in the 18th and 19th dynasty, served as regents for their sons or grandsons. Sometimes for decades. They issued decrees, led temple reforms, even commissioned monuments. Their names appear on treaties and in economic records, often without a single male counterpart in sight. As the council disbands, you trail behind the queen as she exits through the servants' corridor, not to be modest, but to avoid the parade of flatterers waiting at the main stairs. She's got better things to do, like visit the scribal archives, down a shadowy hallway lined with scroll cubbies and dust-coated statues of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing. She reviews a series of correspondence tablets. Some bear the seals of regional governors. Others come from distant courts Babylon, Hatti, maybe even Crete. Diplomacy, too, is a queen's game. Gifts, threats, flattery, and coded silences. All of it filtered through the same stylus-scratched clay. One scroll has her attention longer than the rest. It's not in standard hieratic script, it's foreign, with translations in the margins. You can just make out the phrase, "Daughter of the Sun." A title, a proposal, a bargaining chip, possibly all three. You spot a fringe detail tucked in a side cabinet, a rejected letter from a vassal prince begging for Egyptian grain in exchange for eternal loyalty and 30 horses. The letter is splattered with faded wine stains and smells faintly of lotus perfume. Apparently, diplomacy sometimes includes dinner. Historians still argue whether Egyptian queens responded personally to such messages or dictated them to scribes, who then sweetened the tone. Either way, her style comes through, sharp, deliberate, politely terrifying. Back in her chamber, the queen meets with her steward to go over estate accounts. You expect math. You get maneuvering. She shifts grain from one region to another, reduces tithes in a float-stricken zone, and reassigns temple labor quotasol while sipping pomegranate wine and correcting a servant's pronunciation of a foreign god's name. At one point, She sets down her cup, turns to you, and asks, "Do you know how many boats carry linen from my estates every week?" You hesitate. She answers for you, "More than the priesthood of Ta. That means I can fund 3 festivals and still control the weaving guilds." She's not bragging. She's calculating, and she wants you to know she knows it. You accompany her later to a small portico overlooking the Nile. Barge drift past. Workers chant rhythmically as they unload amphorae. A child runs barefoot along the edge of the dock, giggling until a guard yells and he vanishes behind a fig cart. The queen watches it all, with an expression you can't read. Not kite satisfaction. Not kite weariness. Something in between. "There are things I will never be called," she says quietly, "but I will be remembered." Then she turns and walks away. That evening, a banquet is held in her honor. Technically, it's for the gods, something about the equinox or an obscure star alignment, but everyone knows whose name is being whispered tonight. The queen wears a linen gown, dyed faintly with indigo, a color rare and difficult to make. On her brow sits a delicate ureserpent of divine authority. It gleams in the torchlight like it's waiting to strike. One priest sings her praises in a poem that's definitely been rehearsed, possibly written under duress. A court musician composes a melody in her name, likening her to the moon's reflection in the sacred lake. Everyone claps at the right moments. No one dares to be the first to stop. But she just smiles, and you can't tell if it's real or practiced. Probably both. That's her secret weapon. Ambiguity you can never quite pin down. The night ends with incense, harp music, and the slow extinguishing of oil lamps. The queen lingers in the doorway, bathed in the faint gold glow of a dying flame. She doesn't look back. And you think to yourself, not for the first time, she doesn't need a crown to rule. Just a room full of people who can't stop watching her. You begin the day by following the queen's cat. Not metaphorically, literally. The cat, slim and spotted like moonlight on stone, slips from her chamber just as the sun pierces the courtyard columns. No one stops it. In fact, guards part slightly as it walks by, as if it wears a miniature crown no one can see. You follow, because you've learned that in this place, the animals sometimes know things before the humans do. The cat leads you into the inner archives rooms thick with old air and older secrets. Shelves climb the walls like cliffs, stacked with scrolls, tablets, and tiny bundles wrapped in reeds. A scribe bows to the cat as it passes. No, really. Bow, as in respectful nod and hand to chest. You're beginning to wonder if it technically outranks you. Here, the queen keeps her personal records, not state, decrees, or public accounts, but letters, omens, ritual logs, and dream journals. You spot a scroll detailing a rare lunar eclipse, annotated in the margins with notes like, "Pray again," and, oddly, "Postpone decision." Another mentions a troubling birth daughter with fish mark on shoulder, followed by a question. Is this a sign or a curse? No answer is written. Maybe she's still waiting for one. A mainstream fact: Egyptian queens were not just ceremonial figures. Many were trained in reading and writing, especially within elite households, allowing them to study astronomy, dream interpretation, healing rituals, and court history. Their literacy gave them control over not just politics, but narrative. A nearby shelf holds carved ivory tags, each representing a servant, a landholding, or a specific type of linen. This is her memory, coded into physical tokens. She runs her kingdom not by shouting, but by remembering everything. She knows which estate missed its flax quota 2 springs ago. She knows which nursemaid talks in her sleep. She knows you're reading this scroll, and thinking too hard, the cat yawns, then vanishes behind a curtain. You decide to follow her human instead. The queen is in the palace garden, kneeling by a fig tree. She presses her fingers into the soil, murmurs something, then covers the roots with crushed charcoal. Not a ritual, a remedy. The tree was sick. She noticed. She asked the gardener. Now she's healing it. Nearby, she receives a visitor from the Western Provincesa woman clad in ochre robes, her arms heavy with bronze bracelets. They speak in low voices while exchanging small wrapped gifts. Salt, dried lotus, polished stones. No scribes, no priests. Just 2 women negotiating in a language older than diplomacy-shared motherhood. Shared land. Shared wariness of men who think power only lives on thrones. One quirky tidbit. Some queens kept trained bees in reed hives near their chambers. Believing the hum calmed their minds and carried prayers skyward. You spot one of the hives now, swarming gently in the midday sun. As Servant approaches, scoops a spoonful of honey, and walks off like it's nothing. But you suspect every bee in that hive has a name and a tiny job title. Later, you find the queen supervising a ceremony involving the weighing of sacred wheat. Not gold, not yevils. Wheat. Because if the scales tip wrong, it means someone's skimming. And if someone's skimming, then somewhere, a temple will go hungry, or a village won't pay taxes on time, and suddenly, the entire system shudders. She runs her finger along the edge of the scale like it's a blade, looks at the overseer, says nothing. He turns pale. Historians still argue whether queens actively rooted out corruption or just pretended to, while letting the real players shift behind curtains. But based on how fast the overseer begins, listing weight logs and storage reports, it seems she doesn't pretend much. By dusk, the queen is alone again, seated in her small music room with a harp balanced against her knee. The strings hum beneath her fingers slow, delicate, minor notes. You didn't know she played. Maybe no one does. Maybe this is just for her. Outside the window, the river glows orange and violet. You hear the priests in the distance, calling the gods to sleep. But here, in this shadowed corner of the palace, the queen whispers to her instrument, like it's the only one who answers back honestly. Then she turns slightly, and you realize she's been aware of your presence this whole time. She gestures to the second harp resting nearby. You hesitate, then sit, and for the first time, you play beside her note as witness. Not as observer, but as part of the rhythm she's been orchestrating all along. In this moment, nothing is said, nothing is ordered, but everything is known, because power, at this level, doesn't have to shout. It just hums in the background. Like a harp string, you dream of feathers, not the pretty kind that tickle your nose or drift lazily through sunbeams. These are stiff, bone-white ostrich feathers arranged in perfect rose judging. Weighing, balancing. When you wake, you realize it wasn't a dream. You've been summoned to the Hall of Ma'at. Not the mythic one in the afterlife, though, honestly. The difference feels slim. This is the Queen's Justice Court. It's held in a long, cool chamber with papyrus, scrolls stacked high, and a single golden scale on a pedestal near the dais. At its center, the Queen presides, not reclining, not smiling, not even blinking much. She wears a modest headcloth. No crown today. This isn't about spectacle. It's about finality. Before her, a noble kneels, accused of diverting grain rations from temple granaries to fund his own private shrines. He pleads ignorance. He praises her wisdom. He subtly blames his steward. The Queen listens, silent and unreadable. Then she gestures for a scribe to read aloud the warehouse records. Spoiler alert, the steward may be crooked, but the noble signed every page. A mainstream fact. Egyptian queens, especially regents, could oversee judicial hearings in the absence of the pharaoh. They had the right to summon witnesses, consult temple laws, and issue binding decisions. Some were known to take a keen interest in local disputes, especially when they concerned temple income or royal estates. She doesn't raise her voice, just instructs that the noble pay restitution, forfeit his titles. And here's the interesting bit: donate land to a widows' cooperative recently formed near Memphis. That wasn't in any scroll. That's hers. Inventive justice. Pudic. Even, as the accused is led out, head bowed, she turned slightly toward you and says, "We don't bury men for theft. We let them live with everyone knowing." You file that one away. The rest of the day winds through cases like a fan through incense: boundary disputes, dowry arguments, a particularly dramatic disagreement over whether a crocodile in the irrigation canal was sacred or just inconvenient. She rules on all of them with surgical calm, occasionally asking questions that seem unrelated until they snap everything into focus. In between sessions, she consults with her astrologer. Not for court purposes, at least. Not directly. The astrologer shows her a wax tablet smeared with star positions, circles, and 2 tiny hieroglyphs scratched in the upper corner, one meaning storm, the other birth. She frowns. Not dramatically, just enough to make you think someone's plans are about to shift without warning. One fringe tidbit. It's rumored that some queens kept secret calendars of favorable days for punishments, ceremonies, or even marriages based, not on religious festivals, but on personal omens or dreams. You once saw a servant burn a chicken feather at midnight while muttering a date. You're beginning to understand why, by late afternoon, the court disperses. She retreats to the chamber of purification: marble floors, polished mirrors, and a basin shaped like a lotus. A priestess anoints her hands with myrrh. Another adjusts the folds of her gown. She doesn't speak. You realize justice exhausts her more than politics. Outside, the breeze has picked up. Petals swirl from the courtyard trees. You spot a boy sweeping them into a basket, then pausing to pick out the best ones for drying. He tucks a perfect red bloom into his robe. It's a small act of theft. The Queen sees it, says nothing. Historians still argue whether royal women's justice was harsher or more lenient than male pharaohs. Some claim they ruled with mercy as a virtue. Others insist mercy was just better PR. Based on what you've seen, the truth might lie in a third option. They ruled so well. No one cared what you called it. That night, the queen hosts a private gathering, not a banquet. Not a ritual. Just music, wine, and conversation with a few trusted allies. They speak openly, though never carelessly. The topic shifts from military campaigns to a local festival's budget to the disappointing behavior of someone's cousin who married into a priestly family and now thinks he's Horus incarnate. You ask the queen why she tolerates the petty scandals. She sips her drink, arches an eyebrow, and replies, "Because while they're busy scandalizing each other, they're not looking at my plans." A harpist begins to play, soft, plucking notes that flutter like moths in the torchlight. You watch the queen lean back, hair gaze unfocused, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her cup. You'd think she was relaxing, but then you notice her ring finger taps in perfect rhythm with the song's hidden beat, always counting, always measuring. As the guests leave, one by one, she lingers at the window, staring out across the Nile. Lights flicker in the distance. A boat cuts a silent wake. Somewhere, at Dolparks, the world keeps turning, and she keeps tuning it, like a lyre string stretched between duty and desire. Tomorrow, more hearings, more scrolls, more choices. But tonight, justice has been served. Peace has been observed. And the queen just, for a moment, lets herself breathe. The morning air tastes metallic, sharp and dry, like the breath of a desert god. You step carefully along the hallway tiles, sensing something is different. Not ominous, just significant. Somewhere in the palace, a messenger has arrived, and whatever news he brings is about to tilt the balance again. You're summoned not to the throne room, or the gardens, or the usual receiving halls, but to the roof. Yes, the roof. A space rarely used, save for astronomy or secret conversations. When you reach it, the queen is already there, perched beneath a linen canopy, her eyes fixed on a speck moving steadily across the western dunes. A rider approaches from the Red Land, the borderlands that buffer Egypt from foreign chaos. Dust trails behind him like a comet tail. He dismounts with exaggerated reverence, presenting a sealed letter and a small token, an obsidian amulet shaped like a scarab. You know what that means. Negotiations with desert tribes, possibly involving trade caravans, military alliances, or more often than anyone admits, kidnapped nobility, returned for ransom and favors. A mainstream fact. Egypt's queens were often heavily involved in foreign policy, especially when pharaohs were away at war or too young to rule. Some handled correspondence personally, forging ties through letters, gifts, and strategic marriages. The famous Amarna letters include notes where queens subtly suggest gifts of gold, with just enough edge to imply, or else. The queen reads the missive in silence. No scribe present. No advisors nearby. She doesn't even motion for help. Just reads, then folds the parchment slowly and slides the scarab into a pouch tied at her waist. The rider bows and leaves. She never says a word. Later, she invites only 3 people into her map chamber. A general, a priestess, and you. On a low table lies a map etched into smooth cedar, lines drawn in red ink and obsidian pigment, with markers representing military outposts, irrigation canals, sacred sites, and curiously fortified estates that don't belong to the crown. You watch as she shifts 2 figurines from the Nile Delta toward a zone near the eastern mountains. Bandits, she says quietly, or mercenaries. You can't tell if she's correcting herself or if both terms apply. The priestess offers an interpretation from a dream scroll, mentioning a jackal, chasing a falcon, and vanishing in smoke. Not helpful, but definitely ominous. She doesn't panic. She allocates, assigns, prepares. There's a list forming in her head already. Which grain stores can support displaced families? Which officials might defect if threatened? Which temples will demand bribes, masked as blessings? And just as quickly, she sets the figurines back into place. The general exhales. The priestess nods. You start to realize this wasn't a crisis meeting. It was a test. And you weren't watching her. She was watching all of you. You spend the next few days following her through a flurry of action that doesn't look like action. No battles. No marching. Just letters sent. Offerings increased. Taxes quietly lowered in key provinces. She doesn't shout. She nudges the game board, piece by piece, until the wind begins to shift in her favor. One quirky tidbit. You overhear a servant say the queen once wrote a curse into the hem of her robe. Not embroidered. Written. In invisible ink, made from pomegranate rind and nightshade. Something about whoever betrays my house will carry sand in their mouth forever. You look at her robe a little differently after that. Historians still argue whether queens of Egypt acted with true political agency or simply carried out their husbands' policies behind the scenes, based on the way this queen rewrites military orders and reroutes temple supplies without blinking. You'd say the scene is hers, no, and the husbands are just a footnote. One afternoon, she receives a gift from a foreign court. Rare, beautiful, but impractical in Egypt's dry heat. She hands it off without comment. What she keeps, though, is the carved ivory case. It came inlined with red silk and inscribed with a riddle. She taps the riddle with her fingernail. They want to play games, she mutters. But they forget I'm better at losing. You don't dare ask what that means. At twilight, the queen steps out onto the temple causeway for a purification walk. The priests chant softly, waving incense that curls like memory. She walks barefoot on stone, warmed by the day, trailing a thin line of oil behind her that marks her path like a signature only the gods can read. You follow from a respectful distance. As she reaches the shrine, she places one hand on the altar and speaks a prayer under her breath. You hear one word clearly: continuance. Not peace. Not power. Continuance. That's her real goal, not to win, but to keep the wheel turning just a little longer. That night, the queen sits on her balcony, watching jackals howl across the dunes. She tosses a handful of dates to them casually, like feeding pigeons in a park. One of them looks up and locks eyes with her. Doesn't flinch. Doesn't run. just watches. She nods once, slow and deliberate, and the jackal disappears into the night. You wake before the sun, not from noise. Everything is still, but because something in your bones knows today matters. You slip through the palace's shadowed halls toward the queen's chamber and find her already dressed, draped in deep lapis-colored linen, hair braided with strands of gold. She doesn't say good morning, just glances at you and walks on. You follow without needing to ask. She's going to the temple of Isis. Not for worship. Not exactly. Today is about remembrance. Outside, the sky is bruised violet, streaked with orange. You ride in a small ceremonial bark, poled slowly, upriver by 4 attendants in silence. Her face reflects in the water calm. Unreadable, tinted with torchlight, as the temple looms on the shore, carved with massive reliefs of winged goddesses and unblinking eyes. You feel it. This place was not made for comfort. It was made for memory. She disembarks first. Barefoot, quiet, purposeful. The priests wait in a double row, heads bowed, murmuring invocations to Isis, mistress of magic, restorer of order. But this is no grand festival. There are no crowds, no trumpets, just the queen, her breath, visible in the morning, chill, and the echo of footsteps in sacred stone. A mainstream fact. Many Egyptian queens served as high priestesses or spiritual patrons of Isis and Hathor cults, presiding over rituals too important for male priests alone. Their presence wasn't decorative, it was critical to the performance and balance of the rites. Inside, she kneels before a black basalt statue of the goddess. In her hand, a simple alabaster vial filled with milk and honey. An offering. She pours it slowly, whispering something low, too low for you to catch. But you recognize the cadence. It's not a formal chant. It's a name. Her mother's name. You realize this isn't about politics. Not entirely. This is grief. Ritualized and gilded. Yes, but real. The queen lost her mother last year. The mourning period was public, full of speeches and stylized gestures. But this is private. This is where the memory really lives. 1. Fringe a tidbit. In rare cases, queens would have small hidden shrines built inside major temples where they could grieve in solitude or perform private devotions. Some of these shrines were only rediscovered in the last century. Narrow doorways, concealed behind carved reliefs or shallow staircases under altars. As the temple begins to fill with incense and faint harp music, the queen moves to the sanctuary's inner chamber. No one but you follows. She lifts a small scroll from beneath her robe and places it on the altar. You glimpse the title written in faded ink. Words not to be forgotten. It's not a state document. It's a memory, preserved like a fossil. Historians still argue whether such scrolls contained spells, memoire, or emotional confessions. Whatever this one holds, she leaves it there, like a seed planted for the gods to read later. After the ritual, the queen returns to the river, her mood unreadable, but her pace slower. She stops to press her fingers to the carved name of Isis, as if drawing strength through stone. Then she boards the boat again, and for a while, no one speaks. Back in the palace. The tone shifts. She's not Sadif anything. She seems sharper, like someone who's remembered exactly why they're here and what must be done. She spends the afternoon in the weaving halls, reviewing textiles dyed with indigo, pomegranate, and crushed malachite. She inspects them like a general reviews, troopstite seams, uniform colors, consistent tension. A bad robe could dishonor a ceremony. Or worse, offend a foreign envoy. You watch her pull a flawed tunic aside and quietly instruct it to be sent to a temple orphanage. A mistake isn't useless. She says, it just needs a new audience. That, you think, could be her entire philosophy in one sentence. She moves next to the palace kitchens not to eat, but to inspect. She checks the barley storage. She tastes the date preserves. She questions a steward about saltfish deliveries. No task is beneath her. No detail too small. Because, if something goes wrong, she'll be blamed whether she noticed it or not. One cook hands her a small roll worm, spiced with coriander. She bites it, smiles faintly, then hands it to you. Too dry, she says, and moves on. She's right. Later, she visits the royal stables. The horses are restless today. Sensing a storm, perhaps. She strokes the flank of a bay mare, mutters, something soothing in a dialect you don't recognize. The horse stills. You'd expect nothing less. A servant arrives with Nusa delegation from Nubia, has docked early. They weren't due until next week. The queen sighs. Not in surprise, but in confirmation. They want to catch us off guard, she says, adjusting her cloak. Let's pretend they have. You trail her to the receiving hall, where torches have been hastily lit and seats rearranged. The Nubian envoys enter, cloaked in red linen and gold. Their leader bows, offers gifts obsidianblades, dessert spices, a falcon feather. The queen responds with alabaster jars, fine oils, and a poem. Yes, a poem. Read aloud. In their language. With perfect cadence, it ends with a metaphor about rivers joining before they reach the sea. They applaud. The tension thins. That night, as the palace quiets, you find her again in the rooftop garden. She's not Alonian elderly nurse from her childhood sits beside her. Humming. They speak of old games, bad teachers, a beloved cat who once clawed a priest's robes. Then the queen leans back and says, I've made too many decisions today. Oh, the nurse replies. Then let the stars make one for you tomorrow. Oh. You both look up, and for the first time all day, she smiles without strategy. The palace awakes slower today, as if even the walls are tired, but not the queen. She's already in the papyrus garden, scribes at her side, dictating responses to letters that arrived overnight. There's something different in her tone, not sharper, just more clipped, like the air before a sandstorm. She's done waiting. Today is for action. She dictates with terrifying calm. A note to the temple at Edfu, requesting clarification on grain allotments. A message to a wayward vassal that reads more like a silk-wrapped warning. And a dispatch to a commander in the south coded, subtle, but unmistakably preparing for a shift in policy. You watch the scribe's brushes flick across the papyrus, and you realize each stroke could nudge the course of a kingdom. One mainstream fact: queens in ancient Egypt often issued orders under their own names, especially during periods of co-regency or when the pharaoh was absent or young. Their words carried weight, sometimes more so than the men around them. You accompany her as she moves briskly from garden to storage hall to council chamber, never staying long, never pausing to explain. She speaks. They obey, not out of fear, but because she makes it look like the most rational thing in the world, like she's simply helping gravity do its job. But today isn't all diplomacy. Today she's also meeting with artists. The palace sculptors have been summoned to discuss the latest reliefs planned for a temple facade. They bring sketches, wings outspread, gods towering, queens looking suitably divine. She examines each one like a puzzle, points to one: too much lion, not enough serpent. Another: this hand is wrong. A queen doesn't clutch. She cradles. The sculptors glance at each other, nervous, but nod. They'll revise. She's not just editing art. She's curating how the gods will see her for the next 1,000 years. One quirky tidbit: it's whispered that some queens had specific statues made of themselves in poses designed not for worship, but for posthumous negotiation, with one hip cocked slightly forward, or one hand holding an object of political symbolism. Subtle, sneaky, immortal branding. By midday, the sun flattens everything in gold, and she shifts indoors, reviewing newly acquired trade goods: ivory combs, blue glazed amulets, a strangely shaped vessel from Cyprus that looks more like modern art than ancient utility. She holds it up to the light and says, "It's not beautiful because it's flawless. It's beautiful because someone dared to make it." Then she sets it beside a spearhead on her desk. Historians still argue whether Egyptian queens personally curated diplomatic gifts or simply signed off on decisions made by stewards. But when you see her toss aside a coral necklace for being too eager, you get the sense she's always in control, even over how others try to impress her. Later, she attends a quiet ceremony at a lesser temple on the palace grounds. Not a big event. No drums. No dancing. Just a single priest lighting incense and murmuring prayers to Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth and protection. You didn't expect her to show up here. But she stands beside the altar and places a small amuleta-carved crocodile tooth into the offering bowl. A whisper escapes her lips. You don't catch it, but you recognize the cadence again. This time, it's not grief. It's worry. Someone close to her is pregnant, or trying, or in danger. You decide not to ask. That evening, a performance begins in the central courtyard. Dancers in gold-painted masks reenact the story of Isis and Osiris. The queen watches, hands folded, face unreadably. When the part comes where Isis rebuilds Osiris piece by piece, the queen shifts in her seat. You wonder if she relates. The story ends. Applause follows. And yet she doesn't move. Not until the crowd begins to thin and the music fades does she stand and quietly leave. But instead of returning to her chamber, she walks toward the royal archive. You follow, though no one else does. She lights a single oil lamp and pulls an unmarked scroll from a shelf high up, where most wouldn't even think to look. She reads it silently, then adds a single line in neat, practiced hand. Just one line, then replaces the scroll. You ask, softly, "Is it history?" She replies, "Not yet." Oh. Outside, the wind picks up, stirring the sycamores. A guard sneezes. Somewhere, a cat hisses and vanishes into a hallway. The queen turns to you and says, "Tomorrow, I must be dangerous again." Oh? You don't ask why. You already know. You start the day in silence, walking just a step behind her through the northern gardens. The air is cool, full of dew and distant birdsong, and the queen is holding a pomegranate split in two. Not eating it, just holding, staring into its seeds like they might reveal a prophecy. You're tempted to ask, but something in her expression tells you the answer wouldn't help you sleep any better. She's dressed simply today. No elaborate headdress. No makeup. Just a linen robe dyed the pale gold of sunrise. And yet, somehow, she looks more royal like this than ever. Because today is not about ceremony. Today is about remembering who she is when no one's watching. She leads you into a narrow wing of the palace you've never entered, walls lined with faded tapestries, floors scuffed from centuries of sandals. At the end is a small door. Inside, a chamber filled with shelves. Books, not kite. Scrolls, yes, but also figurines. Sealed jars. Broken bits of crown in velvet-lined boxes. A tiny sandal. A half-burned letter. A memory vault. One mainstream fact. Egyptian queens often curated personal treasuries of sacred, sentimental, or strategic objects. These weren't simply collections of wealth, they were layers of legacy, stitched together to remind them who they'd been, what they'd survived, and what they owed no one. She takes out a delicate diadem, the kind worn during childhood festivals, places it on her head, looks into a bronze mirror, then sets it down. Too small, she says. But she's not talking about the crown. A scroll is unfurled. It's a family tree, though more artistic than practical. Golden falcons represent deceased ancestors, blue lotuses for those remembered fondly. A few black beetles mark names that, let's just say, aren't favorites. She traces one line with her finger pauses at a branch where a name has been scraped out completely. You don't ask. You won't. One fringe tidbit. There are accounts often dismissed as rumor of queens removing a family member from state records altogether, not through exile or execution, but through silence, as if refusing to say a name could erase a soul. Some called it petty. Others called it divine censorship. She rolls up the scroll and hands it to you. "Burn this when I die," she says, then adds, "or when you stop trusting me, whichever comes first." You're not sure if she's joking. You don't ask. The rest of the morning is filled with quiet rituals. She visits a chamber where widows weave linen for temple curtains. She spends time with a mute boy who keeps the palace pigeons and listens to him whistle a tune that even you can't remember later. She kneels beside an elderly scribe whose hand trembles too much to write now, but she lets him trace letters in sand just so he can remember what it felt like to matter. Historians still argue whether these were strategic gestures or sincere connections, whether royal compassion was real or simply a performance. Watching her now, you suspect it's both, and maybe that's what makes it powerful. In the afternoon, she returns to the Hall of Echoes, the long colonnaded room where treaties are signed and marriages arranged. Today, there is no ink and no ceremony, just a single visitor, her eldest daughter. The girl is no longer a child. She's tall, sharp-eyed, and dressed in ceremonial robes that mirror her mother's. They speak quietly, too quietly for you to hear. But their gestures are familiar, firm, formal, then soft around the edges. A hand rests on a shoulder. A nod is exchanged. The daughter leaves with a new ring on her finger. You recognize it. It belonged to the Queen's grandmother, a woman whose face was carved into dozens of temples, but whose voice no one remembers. She'll need it, the Queen murmurs. And not for decoration. You walk with her into the gardens again. The sun is lower now. Shadows long and gold. Bees hover lazily over lavender. Somewhere nearby, a lyre plays light and slow, like someone strumming through memory. She asks, "Do you know how long a statue lasts?" You shrug. 1,000 years? She smiles, until no one remembers what it meant. Then she adds, "That's why I talk to people." Oh. One quirky detail. Beneath the garden bench is a hollow stone. And inside it, a carved ivory dice. One side has been worn smooth. She used to roll it when she was nervous. You wonder when she last touched it. The night comes quickly, and the stars are out before you've realized how dark it's gotten. She stands beneath a sycamore, watching the moon climb over the courtyard wall. Then she whispers, almost to herself, "I'm not afraid of being forgotten. I'm afraid of being misunderstood." Oh. And as she walks back into the palace, fireflies swirl in her wake, like tiny floating lamps trying to catch up. By morning, the palace shifts again. Subtly, but unmistakably, couriers jog a little faster through the halls. Temple officials tighten their cloaks. You smell incense before breakfast, which is rarely a good sign. Something is in motion. And the Queen? She's sitting on the terrace, slicing figs with a blade far too sharp for fruit. She doesn't look up when you approach. Just says, "They've changed the omens again." You glance toward the temple precinct. Smoke is rising in tight curls from a dozen altars. Priests are adjusting their chants. Clearly, the gods are being indecisive. You follow her down a corridor you've never seen before. Passing reliefs of battles no one discusses and doors that open with hidden latches. She leads you into what looks like a war room, except the walls are painted with stars instead of soldiers. At the center, a massive map carved into black granite, filled not with cities or forts, but with dreams, literally. Each symbol marks a prophetic vision, some hers, some collected from seers, dream scribes. Temple dansé, a falcon chasing the sun, a crocodile turning to gold, a woman with two faces laughing in a flood. They're not meant to be decoded, only balanced. She taps 3 of them in succession and says, "This is how we'll survive the next season." Oh, a mainstream fact. Egyptian royalty placed heavy weight on dreams and omens. often consulting dream interpreters before major decisions. There were even official books of dreams stored in temples, cataloging what it meant to dream of cats, knieves, or crumbling teeth. She turns to you and adds, "People trust what they fear, but they follow what they dream." Later, in the royal court, the queen receives an envoy from a neighboring kingdom. He's young, overdressed, and clearly here to negotiate something far above his experience level. She listens patiently while he lists demands disguised as gifts, compliments veiled as threats. Then she stands, walks to the statue of Mata, goddess of balance, and asks, "Do you believe your ruler understands justice?" The envoy stammers. The room stills. She smiles. Not kindly. You don't remember what she says next. Only that the envoy leaves 2 hours later, looking like he aged 10 years. His gifts remain untouched. One fringe tidbit. Some queens were believed to have trained in verbal dueling ritualized rhetoric exercises, where truth and insult were layered so finely, the victim wouldn't realize they'd lost until it was too late. These weren't just courtly games. They were survival skills. By midday, the queen is in the garden again. But this time, she's not inspecting herbs or dictating policies. She's painting. Yes, actually painting. On papyrus. With pigments made from crushed berries and resin, her brushstrokes are confident, almost impatient. You peek. It's not a portrait. It's a scene. A woman walking through a storm, holding a torch that burns, even in the rain. She catches you watching and says, "Sometimes I draw what I need to believe." You don't respond. You just sit beside her, listening to the birds rustle through the reeds. Historians still argue whether queens express themselves through private art, or whether surviving pieces are the work of flatterers and court scribes. But this painting rough, bold, imperfect feels too raw to be propaganda. It feels like therapy. That evening, she calls a meeting in the Moon Ruma circular chamber, only used on the last night of the lunar month. The ceiling is painted silver, and the floor echoes with every step. Around her sit 6 women, a general, a healer, a scribe, a merchant, tous à temple danser, and a grain steward. They talk not of war or law, but of rumors, a tax collector vanishing, a priest accused of poisoning ink wells, a drought upstream that hasn't reached the records yet. The queen listens, then hands each woman a talisman, something small, symbolic, protective. To the general, a feather. To the healer, a dried lotus. To the merchant, a carved bone needle. They say nothing. They just bow and leave. You have no idea what just happened. And you're smart enough not to ask. One quirky detail. Under her seat in the moon room is a faded box filled with pebbles, each one etched with a marque deal made. A promise broken. A secret learned. She doesn't write everything down. Some things she prefers to keep in stone. As the night deepens, the queen finally returns to her chamber. She brushes her hair herself tonight. Slowly, without ceremony. You offer to help, but she waves you off. "I want to remember what it feels like to be tired," she says, "because someday I might miss it." End of sick. You leave her by the window, staring at the stars. A storm is brewing far on the horizon. Lightning flashing without thunder. She doesn't flinch. She just whispers. Let it come. I'm? The storm arrives before dawn, not in the form of thunder, but in people. Messengers clamor at the gates before the city fully wakes. Their horses slick with sweat. Scrolls bound in haste. You hear shouts. Footsteps pounding across polished stone. The unmistakable tone of news that shouldn't have waited until morning. The Queen? Already dressed. Of course. She greets the chaos like an old acquaintance. Who's missing? She asks calmly. Before anyone can speak, they hesitate. Then one replies, the High Priest of Thoth never returned from Memphis. Who? She doesn't blink. And the grain shipments? Still delayed. She closes her eyes for one breath. Maybe two. Then says, start boiling water. Not for tea. And just like that, the palace becomes a hive silent in its coordination, terrifying in its purpose. You trail her down a corridor, through the hall of statues, past murals that now seem less decorative and more instructional. Because this morning, the Queen isn't performing rulership, she's inhabiting it. She convenes a rapid council in the Blue Chamber, where decisions usually unfold over days of incense and proverbs. Not today. Today, scrolls are unrolled with shaky fingers. Maps are thrown onto marble tables. And every voice is a shade too loud. She listens to all of them, then speaks just once. We don't need new plans, she says. We need better memory. She points to a relief on the wall, an old depiction of Queen Ahotep calming a rebellion with a symbolic bloodletting of wine. Not warriors. Copy her. Not the generals. A mainstream fact. Queen Ahotep of Egypt was once credited with rallying troops and quelling uprisings in her son's absence. Some inscriptions refer to her as one who unites the two lands, a title usually reserved for kings. The Queen calls for dancers, singers, food vendors. Yes, really. A sudden street festival. Spontaneous feeling, but meticulously staged. Distraction as diplomacy. She even orders a foreign envoy to receive a public honor-nothing binding. Just enough to make them feel important. And while everyone is watching the parade, she meets in secret with 3 ship captains, a spy who smells like saffron, and a woman no one introduces but who walks like someone born with a knife in her sleeve. They speak quietly. You catch phrases: tributary sabotage, inscription tampering, masks on the wrong gods. It makes no sense, but you know it's vital. She signs a document with red inkrer. Symbolic. Reserved for warnings and divine interventions. Then seals it with her own thumbprint. Not a ring. His skin. One fringe tidbit. Egyptian queens sometimes bypassed the official state seal by using personal marks, thumbprints, pierced symbols, or even hairs wrapped in wax. These weren't legal, but they were feared. Later, as the shadows stretch long and thin across the palace floor, she walks the outer walls, not for safety, for perspective. From here, she sees the docks, the market, the temple roofs, and for a moment, She's just a woman watching her city breathe. She says softly, "They think power is about shouting, but whispers carry farther when no one sees them coming." And you follow her down into the underground Archivessa place, so few know exists that even some priests call it a myth. Rows of sealed boxes, forgotten treaties, unblessed spells. She retrieves a scroll and hands it to you. "If anything happens to me, you take this to the Temple of Neith. No one else." Oh, you look down. It's unmarked. Of course, historians still argue whether these silent vaults truly existed beneath major Egyptian palaces, or if later archaeologists mistook old drainage systems for secret halls. But walking through this one, torchlight flickering on clay tablets and shadowed statues, you have no doubt it's real and dangerous. Back upstairs. She orders the ceremonial boat readied. Not for escape, for statement. If she sails through the capital at dusk, calm and unguarded, the people will believe everything is fine, or at least that someone wants it to be. As you board, the sky begins to melt into pink and rust. The queen stands tall at the prow, a falcon amulet tucked beneath her collar, and offers papyrus scrolls wrapped in ribbons to children on the banks. You see a boy unwrap his and smile, just a blessing written in careful glyphs. Then she kneels, just briefly, and touches the water with her fingers. "This river has outlived kings," she says. "It's not loyalty, it's rhythm." One quirky detail. Queens sometimes inserted miniature prayers or affirmations into their ceremonial clothing, stitched between linen layers, inked onto inner hems, or even hidden inside sandals. Literal wearable hope. When the boat docks again, night is almost here. The torches lining the quay flicker. Crickets begin their songs, and the queen looks tired for the first time in days, but not weakened. Just still. She pauses outside the palace gates, looks up at the stars, then says to you, "Tomorrow, I'll remind them what forgetting costs." And without another word, she disappears through the doors. Tonight, the palace is quieter than you've ever known it. Not silent palaces are never truly silent, but quieter in that heavy, anticipatory way. Like the air before the first drumbeat of a ceremony you didn't know you were invited to. The queen doesn't summon anyone. She doesn't speak unless spoken to, but you can feel it in the air. Something is being prepared. She walks alone, barefoot, across the polished stone of the throne room. No guards, no ladies in waiting, not even her scribe, just her shadow, long and regal, stretching toward the dais where once her grandmother was crowned. She doesn't climb the steps. Instead, she sits at the base, her back resting against the cool lapis inlay, and stares at the bronze doors ahead. "They'll write about this," she says, quietly, or not, depending on who wins. The air smells of myrrh and river clay. Outside, the moon is nearly full, casting a silver light through the high windows, striping the floor like the hide of a divine leopard. It's beautiful. It's ominous. It's very Egyptian. One mainstream fact: full moons were often seen as potent times for ritual decisions, both divine and political. Some major decrees were deliberately issued under the moonlight to suggest cosmic alignment or divine favor. Depending who was watching, you sit beside her. Not speaking, she eventually offers you a dried fig, which feels more like a communion wafer than a snack. You chew in silence. She says, "If I die tomorrow, remember this, I did not serve gods. I negotiated with them." Huh? Then she smiles, "And I drove a better bargain than most." Later, she prepares for bedknot in her usual chamber. But in the inner sanctum, behind the small temple of Hathor, the walls are painted with stars, each one hand-dotted over centuries. And the ceiling is low, intimate, like the inside of a secret. A priestess lights a lamp. The queen nods once. The priestess leaves. She removes her rings one by one, setting them on a cloth marked with protective symbols. You notice her hands are rougher than before. More real. Less divine. Her bracelets clink quietly as she loosens them. Even the heavy pectoral necklace, one shaped like wingses, folded away like a child's drawing. One fringe tidbit. Queens were often embalmed with symbols stitched into their skin post, mortem lines of ink or embedded gold flakes to guide their souls through the underworld. Not all of these marks were mentioned in funerary texts. Some were personal. You realize she's humming a tune. It's off-key, possibly invented, possibly ancient. The lyrics are half lost, but the mood is unmistakable. A lullaby meant not for children, but for power itself. A song to rock, ambition to sleep. She says, "When I was little, I used to think I'd be remembered for how I looked in festivals. Now I hope I'm remembered for who I didn't kill." Oh. Historians still argue whether queens held actual executive control in Egypt or merely influenced the men around them. But if you've learned anything in these 20 days, it's that power isn't a scepter or a title, it's knowing what not to say and when to say it anyway. You follow her to the balcony one last time. Below, the Nile glitters like a vein of molten silver. Papyrus boats drift lazily across its surface, oblivious to palace intrigues or divine dramas. Just water and current and time. The queen places her hand on your shoulder. "Do you think we're ever really remembered?" you ask. She answers, "Only when someone whispers the truth instead of the story." One quirky detail. Beneath the heel of her sandal, you glimpse a carved symbol in ink, pierced by a thorn. You'd never noticed it before. She steps forward, presses it into the dust, and leaves the imprint behind as she turns away. Back inside, she lies down on the ceremonial couch, not her bed. Not her throne, just a couch of cedar and ivory. Used once a year in the fertility rites of Osiris. She folds her hands over her stomach. Not in surrender. In readiness, you dim the lamp. She doesn't open her eyes, just murmurs. Let them write what they want. I already lived it. The wind moves softly through the linen screens. Like breath exhaled from the lungs of history, she sleeps. And now, so can you. And now, your journey through shadowed palaces and perfumed corridors comes gently to an end. The flickering torches, the whispered alliances, the unspoken names etched into stone, they all grow quieter now, settling into the soft folds of memory, like petals pressed inside a forgotten scroll. You've walked beside queens, listened through curtain walls, watched the moon rise over a kingdom built on balance and secrets. And still, you're here still breathing, still wondering, still weightless with wonder. Let the dusty halls fade behind you. Let the Nile's soft current carry away the tension in your shoulders. The dangers, the decisions. The deco room, it all dissolves now. Like ink in warm water. The queen rests. And so should you. Even if history forgets her name, you remember the feeling of her presence, the stillness in her gaze, the quiet courage in her rituals. Maybe that's what truly survives, those little echoes that settle deep inside us when the story stops telling itself and simply begins to hum. So let your eyelids fall like temple doors at dusk. Let your breath slow. Let your mind wander. Picture the stars painted across the chamber ceiling, each one a promise that the night will hold you gently. You've seen the throne and the altar. You've held silence like a scepter. You've walked in sand that remembered every step. Now, rest. Tomorrow, the world will wait. But tonight, you sleep beside queens. Sweet dreams.